evening, and how is everybody doing this evening? Welcome to another episode of TXR, show number 111 to be exact. I am your host, Invader, and we have a very special show for you this evening. Joining us tonight is Thomas Mahler, game director over at the very talented Moon Studios. Thomas, thanks for joining us. How's things over at your end?
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's delighted to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Yeah, pleasure having you on. But before we move on, let me introduce the show panel. Jeremy, you knee deep in snow yet?
Oh yeah, really deep in snow. We have a big storm moving in here shortly, but appreciate you, Thomas, jumping on short notice.
Definitely. Hey, Centurion, how's things over in the desert?
Yeah, wet and rainy, but still able to walk around in a t-shirt.
Nice. Shock, hey, you charged and ready to go for tonight's show?
Yeah, just beat Metroid Prime for the first time.
What?
Just 2 seconds ago, so
Nice.
Charged and ready. It's been holding over my head since I was 14. Never beat it.
All right.
I'm ready to go.
Cool. And hey, Southie, how you been doing? I know you've been, I hope you've been taking it easy on the weekend considering all the lifting you've been doing. South?
Uh-oh.
I think he
It's that mute
put
button.
mute.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Oh man, yeah. I heard what you're saying. Yeah, I can sit here and cry about it all weekend. But yeah, my back is sore, my arms are tired. But yeah, hey, listen, I'm just glad to have Thomas here join us, and it's a pleasure as always to converse with him and interact and pick his brain a little bit.
Definitely. And before we go, just so you know, Megatron will not be able to make it because of scheduling conflict. It's a little earlier than how we usually do things. And Tim, well, he may or may not be joining. He's a little under the weather at the moment, but we'll see. Now, before we get into the panel's questions, Thomas, I would like to begin by asking you about your background in the game industry. What have you previously worked on, and what are your duties as a game director?
Well, do you want the full story? Because I've been in the games
whatever you
industry
feel
for,
like sharing.
I mean, I've been working in games for 15 years now. So, I actually started in a very different path. I always loved games, even as a child, right? I was the kind of kid who grew up. My first computer where I played games was a Commodore 64 when I was 4 years old. And I always loved computer games and so on. But I actually studied traditional sculpture because my way into the industry, because I'm living in Austria, in Vienna, and there is basically no industry here, right? So my way into the industry was by basically saying, hey, I want to be an artist in the industry. And I've always I've been the kid in school who was constantly drawing and so on, right? And so after my school stuff was done, I went to art school and studied traditional sculpture. Then I worked on my portfolio and so on. And then things went a little bit crazy with, I posted my portfolio online. I got job offers from places like Disney and Blizzard and so on. And I decided to join Blizzard. Actually, before that, for a while, I worked at little outsource studios and worked on a couple of games, just doing smaller stuff, just delivering models for certain games and so on. And then I joined Blizzard. I worked on StarCraft 2. And that was an interesting time because when I finished the work on Wings of Liberty, that was right around that time when indie games became a big thing, right? When Microsoft did the whole Xbox Live Arcade thing and so on, and games like Braid came out and Limbo came out and Castle Crashers and so on. So suddenly, indie games became a business, right? You could actually do that. And while I was waiting on getting my visa to actually go to Blizzard, I started prototyping just games, right? I taught myself how to program and so on and prototyped some games. And And around that time when I finished up Wings of Liberty, I talked to one of my friends that I knew at the time, and who then became my co-founder for the studio. And yeah, we showed those prototypes around. That in the end became Ori and the Blind Forest, and yeah, that's kind of like how everything started for me.
Wow. Now, what would be some of your responsibilities as a game director?
Well, everything. I'm mostly doing a ton of design work. So for Blind Forest, like the levels that you jump through, that was basically me, but I write the stories. For Blind Forest, the story was mine. For Will of the Wisps, we actually had other people also jump on board for the story tasks. Because there's also another project that we're working on that is still. Holy shit!
My bad.
Something just exploded. So for Will of the Wisp, we actually shared that responsibility on story, because there's also another secret project that is yet unannounced that we're working on that I'm also heavily involved with. I'm just looking over everything. I'm looking at the design. I have to make sure that, hey, I lay out the structure of the game, that I oversee everything constantly on a daily basis, that I'll, check up with art on making sure, hey, that the art stuff looks good. I make sure that I scream at tech if something doesn't work, at all those nice things.
All right.
You got to make sure that music is good. You got to talk to Gareth and make sure it's up to snuff.
Gareth is actually fairly
on.
painless. Gareth is actually fairly painless to work with. Like Gareth usually is the kind of artist who, he gets access to all our stuff, and then he kind of like shovels off into his hole, right? Then months later he comes back with like, oh, here's a couple of tunes I wrote, and
it just so happens to be a
good.
masterpiece.
Yeah, the guy's a genius.
Yeah, Gareth is pretty good. Yeah.
Oh, he's a great guy. Great guy. We had him on the show actually almost a year ago. And,
I actually listened to that podcast right before I came on the show. Yeah.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
All right, now let's get right into some of our questions here. I'll kick it off. So, Thomas, after the release and success of Ori and the Blind Forest, how did you approach going into working on the sequel, Will of the Wisps? What were important focuses going into the development for it?
Okay, well, can you give you a little bit of that inside story? So initially in the team, I was the person who didn't want to do it. I felt like with Blind Forest, hey, we did a nice thing, and because I'm a creative person, right, I was like, hey, I want to do something completely different. So after we shipped Blind Forest, for some time, I was already prototyping on new stuff, on new games that were in completely new genres and so on. And then at TGAs that year, like over the year, we got so much positive fan feedback and so on, like really touching emails from people who played Blind Forest, who really got emotionally invested into what we did. And and then at TGAs, we were in a hotel room with one of our, back then he was our executive producer, Mark Coates. And he brought up this whole thing of like, hey, why not do a sequel? What actually speaks against that? Like, he is a huge fan of Ori, always has been. And we were pretty lucky with that, right? That at Microsoft, we have a lot of, really hardcore Ori fans, which is still crazy to me, because they're to me, they're the Halo and Gears of War company and so on, right? But then if you actually talk to Phil Spencer and so on, like they really enjoy Ori a lot, and they're really themselves like really, really big fans. So yeah, Mark brought up this whole thing of like, why not do a sequel, right? And one thing that tickled me, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. One thing that he brought up tickled me, and we kind of like started talking about, like the just generally, why do sequels and so on, right? And to me, in that conversation, for the first time, that thing came up of like, hey, if Ori, like if we would see Ori and the Blind Forest as the original Super Mario Bros., right? Then Will of the Wisps, like the sequel, could actually become something like Super Mario Bros. 3. So, I mean, for younger audience members here, younger people who watch the show, right? I think there's a really interesting thing where for a long time, when the Super Mario Bros. 3 released, which was then followed up really quickly by Super Mario World, but for a long time, that game represented basically the best in that genre for a long time, for almost like 2 decades or so, right? Where it's just, this is the best platformer ever made. And usually when you ask that question, like, hey, what's the best platform ever made? Well, it's that NES game, you know? And that's pretty crazy. And me as kind of like, you know, trying to like really be a perfectionist. Like we got a lot of feedback for Ori and the Blind Forest, and generally the feedback was really, you know, good. Like people love the game, and like they usually are full of like positive. They mention a lot of positives, right? But I'm the kind of person who thrives on like I want to know all the negatives. Like I'm much more inclined to like listen to the people who bring up stuff that they didn't like. So to me, kind of like I got excited with that idea of like, yeah, maybe we could do something like that. Like maybe we could take the things that we made that already felt good, but really try to perfect that formula, you know, like that whole thing of like, hey, we know the platforming was already really good. What if we push that a little bit further and make it perfect, right? The combat itself was in Blind Forest was much more focused around the platforming. And then you had games like Hollow Knight and so on coming out, right? Which focused a lot more on just precise hits and so on, right? Which to us wasn't the focus for Blind Forest. And we thought, hey, you know, like we could do that as well, right? And we could really create this perfect package that's just, hey, here's what a platformer should look like and a Metroidvania should look like in like 2019 or 2020. And that in itself was always cool to me. Like when we first talked to Microsoft, I mean, back then, like right now, Metroidvanias have such a resurgence, right? There's quite a few out there. But back then when we did,
a lot of game companies are trying to make these Metroidvania clones or you know what have you in this genre.
Yeah, but back then when we started it, there really wasn't much. I mean, back then I looked at a landscape of like Aquaria came out, which I think at this point barely anybody knows. I mean, it wasn't a huge hit. And then you had things like Shadow Complex, and that was basically it. And I grew up playing all these Nintendo games, and I loved Super Metroid, you know. And generally also, I loved Symphony of the Night and those kind of things, right? And to me, it never made sense that Konami never made a 32-bit console version or like a full, you know, HD console thing of the Symphony of the Night stuff. Like that was always relegated to just mobile, like not mobile, but like the handheld stuff, right? Like the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS and so on. And to me, that was such a weird thing to do, to say, hey, that kind of like 2D stuff is lame, so let's, you know, make a cheaper title for platforms and so on. And I was like, no, I want to see what that would look like if you actually would put tons of resources into it, if you would really go nuts on the animation, if you would not do pixel art, but actually paint all these tiles, you know, and all of that stuff. So that was the original inspiration with Blind Forest. And then for Will of the Wisp, we obviously said, hey, we have all this tech and all this stuff, and let's see what we can do to make it even better.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, thanks for that wonderful insight. A lot of stuff there we didn't know. Jeremy, what would you like to ask him?
So, you know, what kind of features and content was put into Ori and the Will of the Wisp that you weren't able to in the first game?
Okay, so I'm in a little bit of a pickle right now, because when you guys tweeted out about the, you know, that I'm on the TXR podcast, I got a very nice mail from our PR person at Microsoft.
That's always how it goes.
It was very clear.
P's and Q's.
Yeah, it was very clear, like, hey, don't share any major features and so on, or anything that we haven't shown yet or haven't talked about yet. So I can focus on that stuff, but I can't share any new stuff, you know, that we haven't shown yet. And also, I wouldn't like to do it at this point because the game is coming out really soon. And I do really appreciate when people go into something blind, you know, and they don't know exactly what we've been up to, but then they go into it and they're like, holy shit, you know, like that kind of moment of like, I can't believe they did that, you know, and I can't believe, oh my God, this is where you, yeah.
But aren't you afraid of people going in blind? You know, obviously they know what, you know, from the Blind Forest, they know what you guys have done previously, but aren't you afraid of them being let down for the sequel? You know, just going in blind? Don't you want to kind of lay it out a little bit further?
No, I'm not. Like, I think generally I have a pretty good handle on like what constitutes a really good game, and I just generally take that from myself, right? Like, if I have fun with the game and I really enjoy it, and I constantly still find myself having those moments of like, hey, I have a bug open and I have to test the level, and I go in and test it, and then I spend 20 minutes just playing because hey, it's just fun, and you forget that, hey, I just needed to check this quick thing, right? So I still have those moments with Ori. So, and with Will of the Wisps, I think we really, really pushed as much as possible. So I feel pretty good about where this will land. Our goal generally is, I mean, we do look at Metacritic and those kind of things, right? And I do hope that this time we will actually get a 90 plus, that kind of thing.
Well, you deserve it. That's for sure. You created a masterpiece, my friend.
Well, hopefully, at the end of the day, I mean, it's like the players will decide, right, and the press will decide like where it'll land. But I feel like, hey, what we worked on. I mean, it's 4 years that we spent on it now. Like the Ori and the Blind Forest Definitive Edition came out in March 11th, 2016. So it's basically we're looking at 4 years of development time again. That's a long time to work on something, and yeah, we're now seeing kind of like, we're playing through the almost final game, and yeah, I'm pretty certain we will stick the landing.
Nice.
Very nice, very nice. All right, let's move on to Centurion. What would you like to ask our friend here?
All right. So, given the success of the first game, were you surprised at how successful and well received the first game was? And did this help fuel the drive and direction of wanting to get it on the Nintendo Switch?
Yeah, for sure we were surprised because back then, like I was hoping we would get to something like almost 1 million copies sold or something, right? And I mean, by now we are way, way, way above the target. Like it's quite insane how many copies Ori and the Blind Forest sold. And I mean, I think news-wise, we are sometimes falling under the radar right now because Ori was a smaller game and there's not that much, to replay right now.
Not anymore, Thomas. No, not anymore.
Right.
Well, but generally speaking, I think, I mean, the game had an insanely long tail in terms of like people picking it up again and again, and in all the sales, like the game still really sells well, and we're still getting tons of really touching emails and so on. So yeah, I think we were really surprised by that. Like we were just hopefully this becomes successful enough so that we would get another deal, because I mean, it's a really tough world for a developer out there with publishers and so on, right? Where you have to hope that your game actually makes the money back that it costs to make, and then that you get to make another game. And I mean, Ori and the Blind Forest went far beyond that. And the Switch thing was just one of those things, like it came out, like the team, like constantly, honestly, like we get mails all the time about, and still get mails about, hey, can you put it on this platform or that platform? Can you release it on the Switch? We still get people asking, can you put it on the PlayStation 4 and so on? And with the Switch, I mean, literally what we did is we just asked Microsoft. We just reached out to them and asked them like, hey, and I told them, guys, there's so many people who are asking for Blind Forest on the Switch. And
Nintendo's not making a new Metroid anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wasn't expecting the response necessarily. Like I was expecting them to shut it down because it's a pretty crazy ask, right? That we're like, hey, would you mind if we would release that Microsoft first party exclusive from the Xbox on a competitive platform? But I mean, we talked deal wise about like what that would entail and so on, but they were open to it. And I think, I mean, the strategy that Microsoft is following right now, I think is pretty interesting. I think it's pretty different than where Nintendo and Sony are. So I get where they're coming from, that they allow that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's just how that came to be.
So,
like
it doesn't hurt that Nintendo and Microsoft are literally down the street from each other. They have a pretty good working,
for sure,
relationship.
Yeah. So Microsoft definitely holds to that whole ideal of letting the developer actually having a amount of control over the software they produce.
Oh, for sure. Like, I mean, I can only speak as a developer, right? Like when we started out working with Microsoft, like we had a couple of publishers that wanted to make a thing with us, and obviously it's kind of like scary, it's daunting, right? Like you just started this small company, and then you get in bed with a big bad publisher, right? And that was kind of like the thought process that we went in, that there would be people at Microsoft who would tell us, like, hey guys, I have this really great idea. Well, wouldn't you do this, right? Like, why wouldn't you come up with this or that, right? And I mean, there are these stories out there, but honest to God, like we never had anything like that. Like Microsoft never did had anything where they came in and and told us, hey, you guys need to do it this particular thing this way or that way. And we've been really free in terms of just just creating what we wanted to create. And Microsoft has been super supportive in that sense. Like
isn't it part of it because? Oh, go ahead.
I think like we're the luckiest developer in the world. Like we can literally make the stuff that we want to make and get publishers to invest in us. So that it couldn't get any better.
All right.
Is it part of it because of Xbox? The employees are big fans of Ori, that they're like, a lot of us own a Switch, so we would like to have more access to Ori ourselves. So that's why they, we're more open and susceptible for it to be on the Switch.
I mean, I can only speculate. Maybe that was part of it, right? I don't know.
We hope so. But you're right though, because you would think that. Everyone hears about like the scary stories from like, Bungie and Destiny, and how, Activision kind of, just limited everything they had to do and, just overloaded them. So it's nice that you guys have a little bit of freedom and able to do kind of what you want.
Yeah, I mean, again, like we never had any of that. Like we did have those preconceived notions of like, hey, the publisher would, like do all these bad things and so on, because that's what you hear, right? When you read industry news, like when you read the Reset Forum or those kind of things, it's usually like, hey, here's the bad publisher, and then here's the developer, right? And usually the blame gets all put on the publisher if certain choices get made. But yeah, I mean, I can only speak for myself. Like I do know a couple of stories where I feel like, hey, where publishers kind of like take over in a bad way. We just never had that with Microsoft. Like our producer Dan Smith is never did anything like that. But it's like, hey, he's just supportive of us. He tries to kind of like help us with the production and so on, right? But yeah, he's also a big Ori fan, and I think he'll play the games with his kids and so on. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we like that. That's the kind of thing that you want as a developer, right? That you actually start a relationship with a publisher, and that you can actually make the thing that you want to make and see that come to fruition, and not have too many cooks in there that then makes you kind of like feel like, hey, this didn't become what I wanted it to become. So right. Really, I mean, with Ori, I think if we succeed, well, then we succeeded at our own terms, and if we fail, well, then we failed at our own terms, and that's mm-hmm. something I'm very happy with.
Yeah. Now, South, do you have anything to ask him about Ori and the Will of the Wisps?
You know what? I did, but I need a second to kind of formulate how I want to ask it. So go ahead and have someone else ask, and then I'll come back to me.
All right, no problem. We'll get to Shock. Shock, what would you like to ask Thomas about?
I did see a comment recently. I think it was about the specs of like the new Scarlet, and people being worried that dev kits aren't out, as a rumor. And I saw your comment saying that, but you guys already kind of have the test, or kind of have the idea of what the benchmark of what you're looking at for the parts. So as a developer, is it really that much of a hindrance of not actually have the physical dev kit, but knowing exactly what your target specs? Like you said, everybody already knows, what you're working with.
I mean, I think it's different for developers who probably have to do a launch title or something, right? If you really write to the metal basically for it and have to get something out by launch, then yeah, maybe there's an issue. I would assume that those people do have dev kits already, right? Like the people who have to do that and who actually have launch stuff available. And honest to God, I mean, we are in a hardware spec now with those new consoles, right? Where it's like it's
PCs.
they're PCs. Like you can already, like if you know a little bit about that stuff, right? Like you can already pretty much assume what it'll be, right? Like you just know, and it's not that big of a deal, honestly, at this point to work that way. Like I can't say much about Scarlet. I don't honestly know much about it. We don't have dev kits. And I've also been told very much by the PR team at Microsoft that we shouldn't share any Scarlet news or anything, which helps, that we don't even have any hardware or anything. But I mean, just from a developer standpoint, right? Like it really doesn't matter. I mean, at this point, I know the specs of the PlayStation 5 and all this stuff, and like both of those consoles will be, I think, fairly similar. So as a developer, I'm just, like, even if you have to make last minute changes to kind of like, pull things together, I don't think it should be that big of an issue.
All right. Very interesting. Yeah, obviously with Scarlet around the corner, we're all very curious about that. For my question, I was wondering.
Oh, by the way, keep in mind, right, that we are the kind of studio that's making games where it's not necessarily about tech. Like, we're not making tech porn stuff. We're making games that look good because of art direction, not because we're squeezing every single last bit out of the GPU, even though the stuff that we are making is very hardware intensive and so on, right? But not to a point where you have to use the machine to every single bit, like to us, it's much more important that we are a gameplay company first, where we make games that also look amazing because of art direction, and not necessarily because, hey, we have the latest stuff in an engine and we have some crazy graphics feature and so on, right? That's not who we are, right? Like we want to make stuff that is beautiful given the tools that we have, right? Because we're artists, and we don't really care about that, like that latest little tech thing that honestly most of the time.
I think you laid it out perfectly. You said tech porn because your game looks beautiful as it is.
Yeah, I mean that's how we approached it from the start. Like we want to have tools that are easy to use, that really make our artists, like just focus on the art and not necessarily like, hey, on every single one of those objects, turn this new feature on and then it'll look a little bit fancier or so, right? Like at the end of the day, I just feel like, I mean, there is still this tech porn thing going on in the games industry, like, and like, hey, when do we get to games that look photorealistic and so on? And we're just the opposite of that. I mean, I just love games that are great, that are looking great because of art, right? And that have a timeless look to them. Like I want to make games that even in 10 years from now, you could still play and say, wow, that looks great, right? So I'm always amazed with that thing that the games industry is so nuts about using the latest and greatest tech, but then they're forgetting about art direction,
Yep.
Like a lot of the games from the Xbox 360 era with those piss filters and all the stuff, right? It's like, I don't want to play that anymore because the art direction wasn't that great, right? It just made assets and with normal maps and highest texture resolution possible and so on. But then you look at the actual games and like the compositions that you see and, the colors, like the way they use colors. There's a lot of, I mean, I come from art school, right? I look at the stuff and I'm like, well, this is like those folks often didn't really understand what they were doing. They were just doing tech stuff, and that's not really where we want to be. We want to do stuff that looks great because, well, there's an artistic sense behind it, right? And not just, yeah, well, we have the highest res textures and some latest new engine features and so on in there.
So AK 120 frames per second not confirmed.
Actually, frame rate is hugely important to us. Like how our gameplay is, again, like we are a gameplay company first. That's how we see ourselves, right? So all our games will always run at least 60 frames. That's a statement that I always made, right?
Nice.
And that I stand by. And hopefully even more, right? Like if you play Will of the Wisps, obviously you will want to play that if you play on a PC at like 120 frames or something, right? And that's fine. Like that, anything that makes the game feel better, and frame rate definitely, makes games feel better. Like if a game that plays at 60 frames is obviously just plays better and there's less input delay and so on than a game that runs at 30 frames. So that is hugely important to me. I would actually sacrifice some of the art before I sacrifice frame rate.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. So for Will of the Wisps, Ori and the baby owl, I think the character's name's Ku, if I'm not mistaken, are
right.
showing off. They're showing off very prominently together in trailers and artwork. Now, I understand, without getting into too deep into the story, because I realize you want to keep away from that. Can we expect Ku to play a big part in possibly gameplay elements?
So I don't want to say too much about that. I want you to experience that. She does play a huge role in the story, of course. That's why we showed
I love
her
the
many
Gandalf
times.
look.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm a pipe smoker. But yeah, in terms of story, definitely she plays a huge role. So for me, I mean, Blind Forest was very much a coming of age story with, where Ori at the start of the game had to say goodbye to his mother, and it was about that triangular relationship with those two mothers. Like one takes one path and the other one takes another path, right? And then at the end, that's on a collision path, basically. And this time, I think for Will of the Wisps, I mean, the story is much more about brothers and sisters, where the idea is that Ori is kind of like the brother and Ku is basically Ori's sister, right? That kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, there is no gender stuff in Ori, right? But that's the kind of idea that they're basically being treated as siblings. And I don't want to share too much because I do want people, like we spent so much time on the story and then all these emotional beats and so on, that I really want people to just experience that for themselves. Like I'm hugely looking forward. Like that's one of the things that I like, at least like inside our studio, we're really looking forward to once the game launches, like the first, people who stream the games, like really watching their reactions, right? And all the stuff that we did. Like that's going to be really interesting because there's some really heavy beats in Will of the Wisps where I think, hey, people will really be often maybe quite shocked about the decisions that we made.
Wow.
Okay.
Now, did you guys change the way the story was presented in the game to flesh out some of the world and characters?
Could you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
So, it was very narrative driven and very visual. The story in Ori was very visual in the first game. Mm-hmm. Did you guys change the way it was presented? Meaning, did you use, whether it's in-game cutscenes or, full motion video, et cetera, to kind of flesh out the world and the characters?
No, so basically how I want you to see Will of the Wisps is basically think of Ori and the Blind Forest on steroids, right? So There's still a certain tone to Ori where we try always to tell our stories with as little dialogue as possible, because I want people from India who don't necessarily speak English or something, right, to get as much out of the game as Americans and Europeans and so on. Like, I want this to be a global thing. So telling, and that's just a theme that fits Ori, right? That we do a lot with just animation and body language and so on. And I want to be able to act like our animators, to act out a scene where just through how they act the characters, right, that you would get that it would say everything, right? And generally the idea with Ori is that, if you don't have to use words, don't use words, right? If you can get the information across purely through acting, purely through the music, because music is also one of, like, we basically do it through acting and we do it through music. And music is one of those things that often in games isn't used as a storytelling device, right? And I think that's a fault, because music is such an important storytelling tool. And I mean, we already did this in Blind Forest. If you would actually play Ori and the Blind Forest, and just take the prologue, for example, right? If we wouldn't have had Gareth there, kind of like infusing the story and like helping out the story with music, right? The beats wouldn't have hit as hard as they would have otherwise. And we were okay with saying, well, we'll set it up that way, and we trust Gareth to actually come through with the music and come through with basically the music being as important as the script. Because that was a big important thing to us. And I think in a lot of games right now, when great composers are used, they're used in the wrong way, right? Like, I mean, a silly example is for Call of Duty, Activision hired Hans Zimmer, right? And then what did they use it for? For the main theme when you're in the title screen. It's like, really, that's what you used him for, right? No, you should have used it for story moments where you try to tell a story and you try to convey a certain mood and you want to kind of like manipulate the audience to feel a certain thing, right? Like, why waste a composer on like, on just music that you play during the title screen? Like, I mean, I love a good title track, right? But really, I think music should much more often in games be used as a storytelling device, similar to how it's done in films, right? That it's a tool to really help manipulate the audience to make you feel
right, immersive. Yeah, no, you guys really hit a 10 with it when bringing Gareth in. Like Jeremy's asking, part of the story was, like you said, was the music, the soundtrack.
Mm-hmm. And that was a calculated thing. Like that's something that we were okay with. We knew, hey, we wanted to do really reduced storytelling to the point where it has to come across basically through animation. So we trusted our animator back then, James Benson, who now works at Valve. We wanted to trust him on just getting the story across that way, and then at the same time trust Gareth that he also helps the story that way, right? And that just became that then just like that's what Ori became. That's what Ori is now, right? That we don't use that much text, that you don't have like tons of text boxes constantly to click through. So we definitely kept true to that.
All right, very interesting. Centurion, you're up next. What would you like to ask the man?
Man, we can get back to me.
Oh, well,
if he wants to go first.
All right.
I want to go. South. It's my turn.
Okay, South, go right ahead. Southbound.
No, you know what? No. I'm real curious about Game Pass. Because we us as general public, we don't know the distribution of wealth. So obviously you have to keep your doors open and everything else. And I think a lot of misconception is, oh, well, Game Pass, it doesn't really give you guys money as a developers. But is it a double-edged sword where you rather have more people have the game in hands, or is it, copies sold? What's the pros and cons to a Game Pass situation?
So I can't share details on that because of NDAs. But obviously, like with Microsoft, right, they have to make sure that developers are happy about Game Pass. So to us, definitely, I mean, with Wisps, it'll be really, really interesting to see how many people will try Ori, right? Because one of the things that we actually saw that was really interesting to us was there were a lot of people who told us, hey, I wasn't interested in playing a platformer, like I'm more of a shooter fan and so on. But then I got Ori on sale and I tried it, and now it's one of my favorite games, right? Like usually there's this thing of it's not necessarily like, even if you're not necessarily a platformer fan or even a Metroidvania fan, the game has a certain addictive quality to it, right? Because we made it so tight and so on. And then when people play it, even people who don't usually love the genre, right, or usually maybe wouldn't give that game in that genre a chance, that when they try it, they actually really like it, right? So one of the enticing things about Game Pass for me is my hope is that a lot more people will give it a try, and then maybe fall in love with it, like hopefully, or maybe they won't care at all, right? But then at least they were able to give it a chance without first having to pay a lot. I think generally, I mean, one of the big things in the industry that probably has to change, and it's probably not clear kind of like how we can change that and still make development feasible, is this whole thing of like, hey, if I want to try a game, a demo oftentimes isn't great, right? Like a demo experience oftentimes, like I played demos before where I felt like, hey, that demo was weak, but then I played the full game and I was like, wow, thank God I didn't make my buying decision just based on the demo. But the problem is, if you have to spend $60 to $70 or euros, right, on something before you understand, hey, do I like this thing, do I want to spend my time with that, that's a huge upfront cost to pay. I mean, that's like $60 to $70, right? Like that's not a small sum, right? That's something where, it's not an impulse buy at that point. It's something that you think about. So So I think that's an interesting thing with Game Pass, right? That people can just try it, and hopefully we'll see that, right? That a lot of people who are usually not into platformers or into Metroidvanias, right? That, hey, because it's on Game Pass, they will give it a try and maybe they will really like it, So that's
So
gonna
do
be
you hope that, if people try it and they play it on Game Pass, that they will further like, okay, well, I played it on Game Pass, so let me buy it for a friend or a brother,
yeah,
sister, daughter. Is
or
that
at
the
least
hope,
recommend
or
it. Or at
right?
least recommend it, right? Like at least basically be out there and spread word of mouth, right? Like if you like a game, if you really love a game and it did something for you, right? Like with great films, for example, right? If you watch a great film and the credit rolls, the end credits roll, well, the immediate thing is like, hey, you're speechless, right? And then you want to tell everybody about it, right? Like, hey, have
Right.
you seen this film yet? It's amazing. It did, something amazing for me. You should really watch that, right? And that's definitely what I hope would happen, right? That people just kind of like share that story, right? That, hey, I played this thing. I came in with no expectations. I played this thing and it amazed me. And, you should play it as well, right? That kind of thing. Because there is something really interesting there. Because, I mean, generally speaking, with games, I think there's still, this huge upfront cost overall, right? Like if you have to buy a console that costs $400 or $500 or something, right? And then you have to buy the games that are really expensive and so on. So I think there's, that's one of the problems the industry has to solve, this huge upfront cost before you can actually get into gaming. So I think there's interesting things happening right now in the industry that hopefully will make more people interested in games generally.
No, definitely. That's an interesting comment right there. All right, Centurion, you're up next. What would you like to ask?
I'm going to modify my question because Downer already popped the lid off of what I was going to go for. So, are sales for the first game still strong to this day? You don't got to put a number on it.
Yeah, I mean, we are always amazed kind of like by how well the game still sells, like,
Okay.
I mean, we thought, because generally the idea is in the first year, the game has the best sales, right? And actually for Ori, that wasn't even the case. Like, I think in year 3, we sold a crazy amount of units because then Ori was also in sales and so on, right? But it continually kept selling and kept selling and kept selling. And I think it's like with a good film, right? Like, I mean, look at Shawshank Redemption or something, right? Which flopped Ori didn't flop, but which, Shawshank Redemption kind of like flopped at the theaters, right? But then, people keep watching it, and keep watching it on streaming services and buy the DVDs and so on, simply because I think at the end of the day, if something is of high quality, then people will want to experience that at some point, right?
So with it still in Game Pass, it's still selling well.
Yeah, we are happy with the numbers.
And now, coming from a developer point of view, to kind of like, because the whole idea of Game Pass is interested to a lot of people, would you say from a developer point of view that Game Pass not only makes gaming accessible for the fan base, but it also makes it to where the console platform is more accessible for a developer?
I mean, it remains to be seen. Game Pass is still a new thing. I don't know, right? Like we're taking a bit of a gamble with all of that right now. It really remains to be seen. I hope we'll see the positive effects of it. And we obviously took that gamble with Microsoft and think, hey, this could have a positive influence. But we'll have to see.
All right.
I think it also helps boost all the Switch sales because everybody sees like Ori on the Xbox and have been, asking for it for the Switch. So I think it also helps that kind of word of mouth as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think at this point in the industry, right, or generally with everything, I mean, that is a little bit contrary to what I just said regarding price and so on, right? But really, at the end of the day, I think if you pick a game that you want to play, especially if you're older, right, and have a job and so on, a lot of times it's not necessarily about how much does it cost, but also, do I have the time to spend on it? I mean, I don't know how old you guys are, right? But for me, I don't have that much time to play games all the time, right? Like I used to, as in my teens and so on, and during art school and so on, I used to play like 1 or 2 games a month, if I could, and could find games cheaply and so on. And then when you get older and have a job and so on, then that number really reduces, because I have a kid now, for example, right? So that number really reduces. So you start really picking the best stuff, the stuff that you really want to experience, and that really, I think, changed recently, because there's so many games out there, and that that middle space kind of fell away. That I think a lot of people don't necessarily, if you're a 60, 70, even low 80 Metacritic rating kind of game, right? That those games would have gotten a chance by players back in the day, and now it's much harder. So I think with stuff like Game Pass, actually, those games, people might get to play those games, even if they're a little bit niche and so on. But yeah.
Well, because like Game Pass, their motto is, find your next favorite game or something. So it's pretty cool, because a lot of people like you said, wouldn't normally purchase these games or find these, hidden gems in this collection.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
Well, one of the interesting things that we've seen, right, and that's an interesting industry thing again, is that there are a lot of live games out now, right, and games that just constantly get changed. Things like your Sea of Thieves, or even games like Don't Starve, right? That you have a release, and then the game gets rated by all the press, and it will get that, like, it will have that rating, and that conception of like it's that kind of game, right? Until the very end, right? Until for forever. Even though as a developer, you can now actually go ahead and kind of like change your game after release, right? Which is a weird thing. Like, you never have that with movies, right? Like when a movie comes out, I mean, usually maybe you will see a director's cut or something, right? But that usually doesn't drastically change the game. But with games right now, we do see games where they come out and they might have launched too early or that kind of stuff, right? But then developers go in and change it and make it better and make it better and make it better, right? And that should really also change the ratings and so on. But that doesn't happen right now in the industry.
I never agreed on how the gaming media doesn't do a re-review of the game after certain stuff like that.
Yep.
I would definitely say, I mean, I know of quite a few games that came out. I didn't like them, but then they got changed and patched and so on, right? And then, hey, this is actually really, really, really good now.
For me, it was Elder Scrolls Online. That game was totally different when it came out on the PC compared to the console port.
Right. And I think that's an interesting thing, right? And so with Game Pass, I mean, with Sea of Thieves, it was the same thing. I mean, when that came out, it had like, a 50 Metacritic or something, right? And then they kept adding stuff to it. And there is a fan base that really likes that game. And I mean, from that aspect, I think that's really interesting, right? That we have those kind of experiences now, where people can just stick with it and, and get the kick and talk to developers and even interact with the developers and maybe even get to influence the game a little bit, like what direction it's heading into. Mm-hmm. Because then as a developer, you can listen to the community and give them exactly what they want. So I think in that regard, it's very interesting, and the industry, I think, has to adapt to that a little bit, because I mean, at the end of the day, we will see and are seeing more and more games coming out that way. I mean, this is not true for Ori, obviously, right? Ori is kind of like has to be this perfect package upon release, and then maybe we'll do slight little patches if like people see some bugs or something, right? But we will not drastically alter the game, right? But that is an interesting thing, I would like to do that at some point, that we work on something where it's like, hey, we can constantly change this and perfect it. And again, like, I'm a perfectionist, right? I would actually love to have that kind of back and forth with our fans and really try to make this shiny, perfect thing that is almost hard to criticize, because it's just like we ironed out everything, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. South is going to ask another question, and then we'll go to Shock.
Okay. So without going into, to specifics, and I mean, obviously you can't really, say the whole story, but you touched on earlier that after Ori, Blind Forest came out, you started, prototyping new ideas and different games. Well, now that you obviously Ori was a hit, you had a position of strength. So how was it when it came back to the negotiating table? You're like, well, I want to do something different, and Microsoft were like, well, we want a sequel. Like did you were able to work it out? Was it money or was it creativity? Like how for a developer like yourself, what change your mind to say, okay, you know what, we'll do a sequel instead of something else?
Well, first of all, we are okay. So I have to be really careful right now.
Right, yeah, that's what I said. Don't you can't get into specifics, but
Some Microsoft
yeah,
PR
obviously.
individual sitting forward in their chair right now.
Yeah, it's probably a laser point.
See, this is a Timmy question, the precision question right here.
They're behind this camera.
So let me try to answer it. So, I mean, some of the prototypes that I made, we actually shipped around, right? And I like showed basically to some publishers and so on. And there was quite a bit of interest, right? But then I think for us, it also came back to, well, there's so much fan response, that people really would love to have a sequel, right? Would love to see something more Ori and would love to see us kind of like perfecting what we did. And as a creative, I'm obviously a little bit in that camp of, do we want to spend, the next couple of years doing something similar to what we just did, or do we want to do something new? Yeah. But then I think there is something really interesting in being able to take the thing that you did and then revolutionize it almost, right? And like make it perfect, or trying to get to that as close as possible. So I think that won over. And then, I mean, nobody's saying we're not also making something different, So, I mean, we do have another project in the pipeline. I can't say what that is. Right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, it could be Ori 3 or it could be something else. Like, I honestly, I can't say right now. But
well, we love the hit regardless.
That's how we approach it. That's kind of like
the gameplay was tight on that. You showed me it was a while ago, but it was nice.
So can you repeat your question? Can you cut out for me?
Yeah, you broke out it, Jeremy. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, all that 250 down and up, you can't even have a good signal, buddy.
I did an article on this, on the stability of the internet in Montana.
I think I know what you asked, but can you just repeat the question just so I'm sure?
The prototype you were working on was pretty tight.
Well, there were a couple. Which one do you mean?
I don't want to get it. Well, I don't know if you can get into specifics, but it was a down, over the top adventure game, side scroller. Might have been early build.
Oh, that okay, yeah. Well, I did a whole bunch of prototypes. And yeah, I mean, I do this all the time. I actually really like that, showing something early, because no other developer is doing that. And I always found that stupid, like why aren't we seeing stuff like that? Where you just basically get see a little bit like, hey, would people get excited about us doing something like this? So doing something like that, right? And I just like that. I just, it's almost like jamming, like when you're a musician and you play with a couple of people, right? And you're just jamming on your instruments and hope that, hey, some melody comes out of that or something comes out of that, right? To me, prototypes are a similar thing where I can just sit down with some idea and then I put it together and then, I refine it and noodle around with it. I show it to some people. I get some feedback. I noodle around with it some more. And then I suddenly have something where I'm like, wow, this could be the next Moon Studios thing. And yeah, I mean, there were so many prototypes. So yeah, I honestly can't say anything specific, but other than, hey, we're working with the Wisps and we're working on another game, but that, that will still take some time for us to actually announce.
Okay. All right. Very informative. Shock, you're up next, bud. What do you want to ask?
Yeah, I wanted to know what was probably like your, I guess, biggest inspiration to make Ori. Like, is it like Metroid or Castlevania or something else?
So I think there were multiple inspirations. We looked at, I mean, I can tell you this whole thing. I told that story before. we initially, when we founded Moon Studios, we wanted to do a different game. That game was called War Soup, and was basically me coming from Blizzard and kind of like learning at Blizzard how to play StarCraft 2 properly. That the game was basically chess, and the initial pitch that we made to Microsoft and other studios, like other publishers like Electronic Arts and so on, was a game called War Soup, which was this, we called it a real-time strategy first-person shooter. And it was literally like a first-person shooter where you would play a 1v1 or a 2v2, and while the match was going on, you had to upgrade your character, right? And you had to, constantly kind of like get new abilities and new stuff. And even to this point, like I haven't seen someone make a game like that. Like there has been, like, I think after that, some people copied the stuff that we did back then, like the whole wall running and charge jumping and so on, and infusing that into FPS games. Because at that point, when you looked at FPS games, everything was just realistic and everything had to be Call of Duty, and we were like out there saying, no, that fucking is not fun, like why not give me all these abilities and all this stuff, and like even make asymmetrical gameplay, right? Where it's like, hey, if I play this class, I have this kind of set of abilities, but if I play this class, I have this set of abilities. So that's how we started, and then that became too big of a project for us to handle as our first title, and then. Actually, on the 24th of December of 2010, I sat down and kind of like made the first prototype for Blind Forest. And in the morning of basically Christmas, of that Christmas day, right, I was watching Princess Mononoke. And that was the first thing that I thought, hey, it would be interesting. Like, I really like those Kodama figures. It would be interesting to make something around that, like about, hey, what if you play a small creature in a huge forest, like a little spirit or something, right? And so that was the initial spark. But then I also looked at games like, hey, like Super Meat Boy came out at that point, shortly before, and that had really tight platforming controls. And I really liked that. Like for a long time, I was constantly going on about how Super Mario Bros. 3 to me was the best platform ever made. And suddenly you had Super Meat Boy out there, and it had such tight controls. And I suddenly really enjoyed that game because it really tickled something in me, right? It's like, wow, this is super tight. This really plays like something that you potentially could have even done on the NES, right? There was nothing stopping you. And I think that was an interesting thing that kind of like that we allowed ourselves to get some influence by. And then there's tons of things. Like once other people came into the mix, right? Like there's tons of influences constantly. Like films that you see, books that you read, music that you listen to. I mean, a lot of times when I'm writing stories, I listen to music that I like classical stuff or from film composers and so on. And I just close my eyes and write and try to kind of like have something in my head of like, hey, here's the main idea that I had. And then you imagine some scenes, that could happen in that kind of like world, and you write that down and so on. Like there's inspiration basically that you find in everything, right? And then with games as well, like any cool new mechanic or something that the developer is doing, like, hey, if that or something like that would fit for our game, then hey, let's have a design discussion about that. But yeah, inspiration is basically everywhere. Like you have to look at everything, and you can't have to constantly learn and constantly stay open to everything. Even if you at first you might be not feeling too great about a certain idea that somebody brings up, right? A lot of times in the studio we find that the stupid idea becomes the great idea at some point, right? That somebody, like a lot of times, like in our designs, right? Like design often happens in discussions. Like when I'm unsure about a certain design, I start, a design chat in our team, and we just discuss things and debate it, right? And then a lot of times people just shout out something like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if this would happen, right? Or if we would have something like that. And then even if immediately it's like, whoa, that's weird, that's out there. But then when you think about it, oftentimes it becomes something that's like, actually, hang on, there is something there, even though it might sound totally weird. But if you do it like this, and then would add that, and then this could totally work, and now we are getting all excited about that. So yeah.
All right, very cool. Obviously, we realize that you're very busy with working, but is it okay if we ask another like 2 or 3 quick questions?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, fantastic. I'll take this one then. Now, was there any discussions or temptations to add multiplayer or co-op elements to the game, or has it always been purely single player, especially moving into the sequel, Will of the Wisps?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question. Because we initially Microsoft did bring that up. Like that was one of the things that they wanted us to explore. Like this whole, hey, with Will of the Wisps, is there a possibility to do multiplayer stuff? And we explored that. And we had some tests that felt interesting, but we could never really make it work together. Like for certain modes and so on, it might have been fun. Or then, but then we kind of like, like it didn't work. It caused so many issues and other things like, hey, when you start that sequence, right? Like what if the other player still jumps around or hasn't caught up yet and so on? There's so many issues that brought up, right? That we started chipping away on that. And then it just became something that felt kind of shallow, like the stuff that Nintendo was doing with Mario Galaxy, right? Where it's like, hey, the second player can move this little thing around, but doesn't really have the same gameplay, that the main player has, and that just didn't become that interesting to us anymore. That then felt like, hey, invite a person that you don't like and give him the second controller, and like have him suffer through that. So that didn't seem that interesting to us. So we kind of like at some point said, hey, really for Metroidvania, it doesn't really work. Like at least like we couldn't find a way of making it still enticing and really making that Ori formula still work, like those moments of, hey, something important happens and make that work with 2 players. Yeah, we tried it and didn't quite work out.
Okay. All right. Very informative. Jeremy, go right ahead.
So how much, and this might be a loaded question, Thomas, but how much larger is the gameplay world in Ori as opposed to the Blind Forest?
Yeah, so that's also really interesting. So looking at the final map, it's a lot larger. It's a much bigger game than Blind Forest. And I actually we didn't start out saying that because I love the idea of something that is perfect in itself, right? That is that stands by itself because of, here's the work, it has a certain gestalt, right? And that's it, and that's what it wants to be. So for example, right, like the Mona Lisa isn't better if you would add more space around it and more stuff, but it's just, this is the work and this is all it needs to be. So to me, the length that we had in Blind Forest was actually pretty okay. And we started out saying, hey, the game doesn't necessarily need to be much bigger than that. Bigger is okay if we find good ideas that are really enticing, right? Like we're not shying away from making it bigger, but it shouldn't be bigger just because of padding or some of that, right? Just so we can tick a box on the back of the box, right? And say, hey, this is now 50 hours of gameplay or something like that. That is something that I'm not interested in. Actually, we're ruthless at Moon Studios about cutting stuff. Especially kind of like during the final stages of development, like if something isn't up to that standard of quality, just cut it, it's similar to editing.
Story-driven title.
Right. It's similar to editing a film, right? Where I mean, film directors will constantly tell you, hey, a film is really made in the editing phase and not necessarily while shooting, because you shoot so much stuff and you have no idea what it'll be. But then you sit down on the editing table and then it's like, okay, what story are we telling here, right? How do we make that tight, and how do we make all those things connect together so that it really tells a cohesive story, so that those beats really matter and like they're paced out nicely and there's a certain rhythm to everything, right? And that's kind of like how I feel about gameplay as well. So it's a lot bigger, but then not to a degree where, hey, just because of the length of the size of the world, it's like, now you have to play 50 hours, but it's a lot deeper as well. And that's the interesting thing to me, right? That hey, we have a certain world. How can we make retraversing more fun? How can we make, people replaying the game more fun? Or people coming back to a certain area and finding new things, discovering new areas or something, right? That kind of thing, like the depth of it, to me, a lot of times is more important than just the breadth of it, right? That kind of thing. And I think we achieved that with Will of the Wisps, that it's not just bigger than Ori and the Blind Forest, and it is, but it's so much deeper. You can play the game in so many different ways now where,
Nice.
you have all these weapons and so on, and you could decide, hey, I'll play through the game, because Ori became also huge with speedrunners, right?
Oh yeah.
And people played through the game multiple times. And one of the things to me like that I wanted to solve was, hey, if you play through the game once and then you play through it again, that potentially on your second playthrough or even on your third playthrough, that you could have a really different experience, playing it. So we made the game more open than Ori and the Blind Forest. It's not kind of like linear in that sense, but you can actually decide where to go and do things kind of like out of order, because there isn't necessarily a straight order that we tell you. You have to do certain things, right? And that to me was really interesting, because I mean, honestly, even today I sometimes still play Zelda 1 on the NES, and that is also a game that kind of like works with that structure, right? Where it's like, hey, you can do things out of order. And I mean, Breath of the Wild came out a while ago, right? And that had a similar thing where it's like, hey, I can actually do things in a way that the developer might not have foreseen it, right? And that to us was just interesting. So that, hey, you could play Blind Forest, you could finish it, and then you could play it again and have a blast with it still, right? Because now you find weapons and stuff and spells and so on that you didn't find on your first playthrough, that feel completely different or make the game feel really, really different, That was really important to us.
Okay. All right. Centurion, you're up next.
All right. My last question. You can treat it completely as a yes or no, or if you don't want to answer it, that's perfectly understandable.
Those are usually the questions that get me in trouble.
Well, that's okay, right? Do you have any plans, or are you already cooking up any plans once Ori and Will of the Wisps is out into the wild? Like, do you already have another project that you guys are cooking up for the future?
Oh, yeah. I can say that. We have been working on an unannounced title for quite some time. And that is looking really good. Like, we're all really passionate about that already. So basically the idea right now, the plan is, well, when Will of the Wisp ships, that the entire team moves over to the next game, to the game that some of our team has already been working on for some time.
So you guys are already getting something ready for next gen.
That's correct.
All right.
Very interesting. And I believe to end this all off, Southbound, I believe you have a question lined up for Thomas.
Yeah, it's not too in depth. I just real quick, is there somebody that really surprised you, like that you because I know in the game industry it's humbling. Is there somebody that you really look up to or admire that came up to you and said, "Man, I really loved Ori"? That just shocked you.
You mean another developer?
Yeah, anybody, a developer, celebrity, just a regular Joe, anybody that you admire or look up to.
I mean, it's always a huge thing, because as an artist, like, once you show your thing, right, you make yourself really vulnerable, right? And I don't know if you guys have been in that position, like if you have, if you're musicians or painters or ever wrote a book or anything, right? But
Thomas,
moment,
none of us have any talent whatsoever.
I don't
that's why we're looking off of you.
I don't believe that everybody has some talent in something, right? Or like, look at the TXR podcast that you guys are running, right? I'm sure the first time you guys put that online, right, and kind of like spread the word that you're starting a podcast, that response that you get, is like, that's really interesting. And that's what you have as an artist, right? That you, especially if you work on something for as long as we work on our titles, like, we basically, for an Ori game to make it basically takes us 4 years of time. And that's a long time, again, like, to be working on something. And then when you release it, it puts you psychologically into such a weird state of complete vulnerability, right? Because suddenly, from one moment to the other, you have people basically judging you and potentially,
I'll say how crazy we get on Twitter.
Yeah, but potentially, like when that moment happens, right, it could ruin your career if you fucked up.
Oh yeah.
During that time, like your career could be over right there, right? And so those moments of like people saying, hey, we really like this, or I really like the stuff that you guys did, right? And I mean, we had tons of people doing that, like, I mean, at those parties, and I'm not a huge party guy, right, but at those E3 parties, and you do meet people like Tim Schafer and Todd Howard and all those kind of people, right? And it's like now you're in midst of, you know, people like, especially like Tim Schafer I remember as a kid, you know, I played, you know, Day of the Tentacle and those kind of things. And suddenly you're standing there and you're like, you know, hey, you know, he knows your game. All those, like, it's kind of like surreal, or like, you know, having Phil Spencer being a huge Ori fan, right? Like those kind of things are just, wow, you know, it's overwhelming to a degree, which is why I love living in Vienna, where I'm away from that craziness of LA and so on. I can just really isolate myself and just be an artist and work on something artistic, you know, and work with my team on something that I hope will be a landmark title and will really make people happy and will put a smile on their faces, and hopefully will also make them cry and will make them go through all those emotions, right? And then shut up again, you know, and then go out of the limelight and say, hey, I hope we made you guys happy. Give us a little bit of time and we'll do something again.
Well, you know, Thomas, I think after all is said and done, you know, I think when Ori 2 finally comes out, and you know your name will be held as, you know, in the Todd Howards and the Tim Schafer. You know,
well, I don't know about that.
I think you and your team do an amazing job, amazing work. I'm really looking forward to Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and I'm sure the world is too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. I mean, to us in the studio, it's not necessarily about ego, right? Like I mean, honest to God, like we still, and this is ridiculous, we still don't have a Moon Studios website, you know, like, because to us, it's really just about creating these super polished products and really focusing all of our time and effort onto that, and not necessarily like, hey, we need to be rock stars, right? Like I really just love the idea of, hey, there's a group of people out there, and we're a distributed studio. We hire people from all around the world, and we try to hire the best talent in the industry. So by now, we are 80 people from over 43 different countries, which is pretty nuts to me. Like we are the most multicultural studio that you can imagine. Like we literally have people from all across the world working on Ori and our other game. And that's something that I'm really proud of. But it's and I'd like to, like, we'd like to have that studio culture where it's not about one person, because one person, you know, isn't able to do everything, right? Like I'm working super hard. I'm doing as much as I can, right? But at Moon, we're making the kind of games that none of us could do on our own, where we make ourselves vulnerable, and we're making it very clear to the team that, hey, this is a team effort, right? And all of you guys really matter, because at the end of the day, none of us could make an Ori on our own, right? And it's this artistic piece that once we release it, it gets released because of the effort that those people put in, that they are passionate about something, that they're putting all that time and all that work and a huge part of their lives into creating something for the people out there, right? That to me is just such a magical thing, right? And that's why I said, like, hey, we're the luckiest people alive, right? Because we can work on things that really matter to us and that we really want to do. And then we can release that. And that's just, and getting paid for that, you know, and like having that as your career is just, I mean, unbelievable. And that's the idea in the studio, that it's not like, you know, it's never the Thomas show or something, right? Because I'd like to think that I come up with good ideas, you know, and so on. But it's about everybody in the team, everybody really feeling passionate about the things that we're creating, everybody having a voice. At Moon, like, hey, everybody's voice matters, right? Like, I don't care if a good idea comes from someone in QA or something, right? Like, if it's a good idea, then it's worthy to be discussed, you know? And I mean, with my experience prior to working at Moon, where I, you know, as a freelancer and so on, I saw studios where there's these very clear hierarchies, right? Where you have these ego plays of some stupid director thinking, I'm a big deal. I'm only doing the stuff that I think is right. I hate that kind of attitude, right? Because it really like, most likely, chances are you don't have all the best ideas in the world, even if you're super talented, right? Like, even if you look at the great directors like a Steven Spielberg or so, right? Like, you have to rely on people like a great cinematographer, right? And if you don't have that, if you don't do that, then you're an idiot, and you will probably not create something great, right? So that's kind of like the culture that we're trying to create at Moon, that everybody here, comes to work and has a chance to work on something that is really special and that really means something to people, and that's beautiful.
Oh.
Nice. Yeah, collaboration is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. Now, we're heading towards the end of our show, but I'm curious, Thomas, have you been playing any games recently?
Oh my God, yeah, I don't have almost any time right now. It's really like the last 6 months were just a slaughter fest. Like, I'm constantly just working. Let me see what have I played recently. I mean, right now I'm playing games that I can play in smaller chunks. I just played through Horizon Chase Turbo, or whatever it's called, on the Switch. Like, that's a little racing game that reminded me of Outrun. That was quite cute. Was like super amazing, greatest thing ever, right? But that was a thing that I quite enjoyed. And generally speaking, like, I'm a huge fan of what From Software is doing. Like, every now and then I still pop in Dark Souls and Bloodborne and those kind of things and play that, because I love the design of those games. Like, generally speaking, I'm huge on just studying game design and understanding level design to a degree that that I don't see a lot in the industry right now. Generally, I feel like level design is kind of like this art form that isn't really properly honed by the industry, because a lot of the stuff out there is like open world stuff, and a lot of times it's like, that level design, like when I play games, I'm like, level design wise, that's just not good.
Well, you picked a great studio. From Software is amazing.
Oh, they are, in terms of level designs and the tightness of the designs that they're making, it's unbelievable. I think generally right now a lot of Japanese studios have that much better figured out. Like, if you look at Nintendo, obviously, right? Like, I'm a huge Nintendo fan, and you look at kind of like how they put their Zeldas and Marios together and so on. Like, they really understand level design to a crazy degree. And generally speaking, I'm always attracted to games that have great level design. I think Arcane is a studio out there that really puts a ton of emphasis on level design, and it shows. You really notice that. Whereas with a lot of other games, that's often not the case. And we actually always are looking for designers that really get it to that degree. I mean, especially also because Ori was hugely important that the level design had to be at such a high quality standard. Because you have, Ori has to hold up as a platformer, and has to be up there, like we have to basically compete with Mario in terms of how good is our platforming, like we are being rated basically on that level, right? And at the same time, well, it also has to be a Metroidvania, and it also, like, now the combat has to be great, and by the way, the story has to be great, and the puzzles need to be really good, and all of that. So yeah, I'm always interested in those kind of things in games where that tightness of design is there.
All right. Very cool. I think we all know what it means to, not having enough time in the day to play the games that we want, but certain ones certainly stand out. But yeah, that about does it for tonight's show. And I think we all learned a lot from tonight's discussion. Thomas, it was great having you on the show. We definitely love to have you back on at some point in the near future. Where can our viewers follow you on social media, and when can everyone pick up Ori and the Will of the Wisps?
So the release date that we announced is February 11th, 2020. And you can follow us on Twitter, like Ori the Game, and just on our Facebook channel.
We
People
got
should
it.
easily be able to find it, like already game.
We got you. We got you. Yeah.
We'll
No.
link you.
Awesome.
We will definitely link you up. But yeah, it was wonderful having you on, and we are definitely pumped and looking forward to Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And I'm sure everybody.
I kind of feel like I maybe talk too much, you know. I don't know, but I hope people find it interesting.
No,
Oh, not at all.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, I'm looking
You're
forward to the
amazing,
game,
brother.
and I really appreciate everything you had to say, and I listen to you very closely, and we all know, I probably speak for everybody here, that the first game won a few awards, and if this builds off the first game, and like you say, is going to be bigger and better than the first game, I really look forward to seeing you on stage a couple times this coming year, basically being appreciated for all the hard effort that you and your team have put into this.
Well, thank you so much. Let's hope that happens. And also, guys, if you get to play the game in a few months, right? Like, hey, just feel free to send me your response, right? Like, I'm always really interested in just hearing the fan feedback and so on, right? Like, hey, if you guys had, any thoughts that you guys had, whether they be positive or negative, I would really appreciate the feedback.
Will do.
We will
Thank you, sir.
definitely get back to you on that, definitely. But yeah, again, thank you for being on. And also a big shout out to all of you that tuned in for tonight's show live. We had a really lively group tonight. Shizno Elite, UK Dazarus, the beer man was here, Delilah HD from very early on, Born Distracted, Mr. Kima, NLG Gaming, all kinds of really cool people joined us tonight. And again, thank you everyone for tuning in. If you happen to enjoy tonight's interview, then share this video out, leave a like, and drop a comment down below. And also don't forget to check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and all kinds of other podcasting apps. Links down below to get your TXR on the go. Guys, again, great show. Now to kick off to the outros. Southbound, where can everybody find you at?
You can find me on Twitter at Southbound110. You can find me on Xbox Live, Southbound110.
All right. Jeremy, where can everybody find you, Mr. Montana Man?
Only on Twitter, Lone Master Who 07. You can find me there.
Perfect. Shock, where can everybody find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Shock Nero on Twitter. And thanks again, Thomas, for joining us with that interview.
For sure, guys. I really appreciated the chance to come on here and speak a little bit about our projects and Ori and the Will of the Wisps with you.
Totally. And Centurion, great show tonight, bud. Where can everybody find you?
Well, I'm all over the place on numerous shows, writing for multiple websites now, as you guys all know. So you guys can find links to all my social media and Xbox Live on legionofgamer.com, along with links to everybody on this show other than our guest.
Fantastic. What a great guest he was. Now, of course, I am Invader. You can find me on my YouTube channel, Invader Gaming. And of course, I'm pretty active on Twitter at Invader_1986. Again, guys, great show. And yeah, we hope to see you tune in next week. Have a good night, fellas.